You're standing at a cruise terminal, looking up at something that barely makes sense as a physical object. A ship, let's say Icon of the Seas, or Wonder of the Seas, or Norwegian Aqua, rising above the pier in a way that doesn't compute with normal architecture. 18 decks, a water park on top, a neighborhood's worth of restaurants stacked above a hull the length of 3 football fields. And the question almost nobody asks, standing right there at the gangway, is the one that actually gets interesting. Not where does it sail, not how much does it cost to run. The question is, where did this thing come from? Who made it? And how? A modern large cruise ship has somewhere north of 300,000 individual components, miles of electrical cable, a power plant, multiple hotels stacked on top of each other inside a steel shell that had to be built simultaneously from the inside out and the outside in. The complexity is roughly on par with building a small skyscraper, except the skyscraper has to float, survive open ocean, and pass inspection from a classification society that will reject it if anything is off. So you'd assume, naturally, that something this complex is produced by a global ecosystem of specialized manufacturers, the way aircraft are built, or semiconductors, or offshore platforms. A dozen competing yards spread across several continents, each carving out a niche. The cruise industry sells a fantasy of escape to the open ocean. The machine that makes that possible is anchored to 3 riverside industrial facilities in Europe that most of its passengers have never heard of. 3 yards, 3 cities. Almost every large cruise ship on the water today came from one of them. The first is Meyerwerft, based in Papenburg, Germany, with a Finnish sister yard, Meyer Turku, acquired in 2014. The 2 Meyer yards together build for Disney, Royal Caribbean's newest and largest class of ships, and TUI cruises. The second is Fincantieri, Italy's dominant shipbuilder, spread across yards at Monfalcone, Marghera, and Sesta di Ponente, primarily building for Carnival Corporation's brands, Viking, and Norwegian's newer ships. The third is Chantier de l'Atlantique in Saint-Nazaire, France, the yard that built the Queen Mary II and the Franz, and now delivers multiple ships in Royal Caribbean's Oasis class and MSC's largest world-class vessels. Between them, they hold order books that run 5 to 8 years deep. A cruise line signing a contract today is signing for a ship it won't touch until the early 2030s. And here's where a reasonable person starts wondering how that actually works physically. If you're going to build something a quarter-mile long and 15 stories tall, you need a facility that can accommodate it, which raises the obvious question of where you put it while it's under construction. You'd assume the answer is a deep water harbor. Build it dockside, launch it when it's ready, done. Ships aren't actually built bow to stern. They're assembled in sections, steel blocks, each one the rough size of a house, fabricated parallel across the yard, and then joined in sequence. The hull and the hotel go up simultaneously. By the time the steel is fully closed, the cabins are already half furnished inside it. It's less like building a ship and more like building 12 ships at once and then welding them together in the right order. Now, most yards do this dockside at a waterfront facility with enough draft to float a finished hull. Meyerwerft's answer from the beginning has been different. Papenburg sits on the Ems River in the far northwest of Germany. The Ems is not a deep-water harbor.
The Ems barely accommodates a large barge, so Meyerwerft built indoors. The yard's construction halls are among the largest covered spaces ever constructed, enclosed dry building facilities where entire cruise ships take shape under roof, out of the weather, in a setting that looks from certain angles like someone installed a skyscraper factory in a small German city. And when a ship is finally finished, fully outfitted, tested, and ready for delivery, there remains the small matter of getting it to the sea it was built to sail. The water level in the lower Ems is raised using a tidal barrage, a river barrier completed in 2002 specifically to make these transits possible. The ship is eased out of its hull, and then it begins moving, slowly, carefully, in a nighttime convoy, down the river, through villages, past bridges it barely clears, with towns lining the banks to watch in the dark. It takes days. It has happened for every ship Meyerwerft has ever delivered. A finished cruise ship, 250 meters of steel and glass and 17 restaurant concepts, inched through a German river at 2 in the morning while locals stand on the shore with their phones out. That is not a special occasion. That is the standard production choreography, every single time. Now, that's Meyerwerft's geography problem, solved by engineering audacity. But the broader question, why these 3 yards and why only these 3, has a different kind of answer. Asian shipbuilders dominate the global market for container ships, tankers, and bulk carriers. South Korean and Japanese yards operate at extraordinary scale and efficiency, winning on cost across most commercial vessel categories. So why haven't they entered cruise ship building? The economics look attractive. Multi-billion-dollar contracts, long lead times, repeat customers. The barrier isn't money. It's knowledge infrastructure that took decades to accumulate and can't be imported or reverse engineered on any timeline that makes business sense. The workforce, the outfitting specialists, the marine interior fabricators, the systems integrators who wire a hotel and a power plant into the same hull, took generations to develop. The supplier ecosystems, the classification society relationships, the project management architecture for a 3-year build with 300,000 parts running on parallel schedules. None of that appears because a well-capitalized company decides it wants to compete. Chinese yards are now attempting the entry. Adora Magic City, delivered in 2023, was the first large cruise ship built in China, a genuine milestone for the domestic Chinese cruise market. But it isn't competing for international cruise contracts yet, and the gap between first ship delivered domestically and preferred builder for Carnival Corporation is measured in decades of accumulated operational proof, which leaves the 3 European yards as the effective permanent supply chain for the entire global cruise industry's expansion. And here is where the story takes a turn most people don't see coming. You'd expect that over time, the natural economic logic of consolidation would push the 3 toward 2. Fewer players, more leverage, more efficiency. That's usually how supply chains this concentrated develop. In 2017, that consolidation almost happened. Fincantieri announced plans to acquire a majority stake in Chantiers de l'Atlantique, with an agreement signed in early 2018. The merger made obvious industrial sense: consolidate 2 of the 3, gain leverage, cut redundancy. France had already signaled how seriously it took the matter. The government briefly nationalized the Saint-Nazaire yard in 2017, specifically to control the terms of any sale. And the European Commission opened an in-depth antitrust investigation in late 2019, concerned that reducing the field from 3 major cruise ship builders to 2 would harm competition across the entire industry. By January 2021, the deal was dead. France and Italy issued a joint statement abandoning the agreement, citing the COVID-19 pandemic's devastation of the cruise sector and the still unresolved EU investigation. A corporate transaction that had made industrial sense on paper had run into a wall built from a pandemic, a regulator's unresolved doubts, and a government that had never fully accepted the idea of a foreign company controlling a yard it considered strategically essential. The 3 stayed 3. What France was protecting wasn't only jobs, though it was that too. Chantiers de l'Atlantique doesn't build only cruise ships. The same yard, the same workforce, the same institutional knowledge, they extend into naval vessel construction. From France's perspective, the Saint-Nazaire yard was something closer to a strategic asset than a factory for sale. The cruise industry's supply chain is insulated by those strategic instincts, in other words, not because cruise lines asked for that protection, but because the governments involved had their own reasons entirely. Which raises the question most people are already asking by this point. If there are only 3 yards and they're carrying 5 to 8 years of orders and they're embedded in national strategic planning on top of that, what happens if one of them gets into financial trouble? Does the whole pipeline just stop? Effectively, yes, and in 2024, it nearly did. Meyerwerft disclosed a severe liquidity crisis. The yard, carrying forward contracts, managing multi-year payroll, financing work in progress across builds that each run 3 years or more, ran into a wall severe enough that its survival was genuinely uncertain. The German federal government and the state government of Lower Saxony stepped in with a rescue package, taking roughly 80% ownership of the yard to stabilize it. The reason the governments moved quickly is the same reason French strategic concerns shaped the merger negotiations throughout. Meyerwerft's order book isn't a list of ships, it's a list of commitments from major cruise lines, Disney, Royal Caribbean, others, for vessels those companies have built their fleet plans around. Ships that, if Meyerwerft had failed, would have no alternative builder. Fincantieri's books are already full. Chantier's is already booked. There is no slack in the system, no overflow capacity waiting to absorb emergency redirects. When one of 3 suppliers in a zero-redundancy supply chain faces insolvency, the governments of the countries those suppliers operate in respond the way other governments respond to banks, too embedded in everything else to be allowed to fail. The cruise industry, which runs its passenger-facing operations with remarkable flexibility, redeploying ships between markets, swapping itineraries on short notice, has quietly built its entire forward expansion on 3 facilities it doesn't own, can't replace, and is now functionally dependent on European sovereign governments to keep running. The capital risk of the industry's growth, the financing exposure of multi-year construction, the systemic fragility of a 3-supplier chain, all of it has settled, gradually and without any formal arrangement, onto the governments of Germany, Italy, and France. That's not nefarious, it's the natural endpoint of extreme specialization taken to its logical conclusion. The cruise lines got so good at ordering ships, and the 3 yards got so good at building them, that the arrangement calcified into the only possible arrangement, and the downside of that calcification landed on the European governments that couldn't afford to absorb it. So, the next time you're standing at a terminal, looking up at something that barely makes sense as a physical object, a ship that appears to have materialized at the pier, fully formed, already running its restaurants, already stocked, already crewed, it has a history that starts considerably further inland than you'd expect.
It started as steel blocks in a covered hull on a river in Germany, or in a yard along the Adriatic, or beside the Loire. It was assembled inside out, furnished while still a skeleton, tested in sections before the hull was ever closed. And if it came from Papenburg, at some point it was walked down a river in the middle of the night, water raised just high enough to float it through, past people who had come out specifically to watch it pass. The 3 yards collectively deliver somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 cruise ships per year at full production. Each one is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar undertaking. Each one has the same supply chain machinery, the same government relationships, the same half-decade planning horizon running behind it. That ship you're boarding isn't a consumer product assembled from a distributed global supply chain. It is a custom manufactured object that one of 3 specialized facilities built over 3 years, under contract to a cruise line that signed the paperwork before some of its future passengers had finished school. It is not a product, it is a dependency. And that's the thing nobody on the gangway is thinking about when they hand over their keycard.
That's another one for the cruise files. If you want to learn more about what goes on behind the giant cruise ships, everything from the scams on board to the secrets below deck, subscribe, like, and share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.